My mother-in-law took my wedding photo off the mantel and put it face down on the coffee table while I was standing in the same room. She didn't ask. She didn't pause. She just reached up, turned it over, and replaced it with an old portrait of the Whitfield family from 1987, my husband as a gap-toothed 7-year-old, his sister Audrey in pigtails, and Margaret and Robert smiling like the kind of people who have never once questioned whether they deserve what they have. There, she said, smoothing the frame with both hands. Much better. I thought that was the lowest she would ever go. I was wrong. My name is Nora. I have been a Whitfield for 3 years, though Margaret has spent every one of those 3 years making clear she doesn't fully accept that. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, in a house where the washing machine was in the kitchen because the landlord never got around to finishing the laundry room, and where my mom worked double shifts at the hospital every other weekend to keep the lights on. I am not from money. I have never pretended to be. And from the first Sunday dinner I sat through at Margaret's table, I understood that in her estimation, those 2 facts were not simply background details. They were permanent disqualifications. Daniel and I met in graduate school. He was finishing his MBA, I was halfway through a social work degree, and we fell in love the way you do when you're 24 and not yet tired fast, completely, and with the kind of certainty that only looks reckless from the outside. We got married on a Saturday in October, small ceremony, his family on one side, my mom and 2 aunts on the other. Robert, Daniel's father, hugged me at the reception and said, "Welcome to the family, kiddo." He meant it. I could tell by the way he looked at me, not measuring, not calculating, just open. Margaret kissed my cheek and said, "I hope you know what you're taking on." At the time I thought she meant marriage in general. The house on Birchwood Lane was a wedding gift. That was how Daniel told me about it casually, the week before the ceremony. Like he was mentioning we'd registered at Crate and Barrel. "My dad wants us to have the house," he said. "The one on Birchwood. He's been renting it out for years. He said it's time it stayed in the family." It was a craftsman bungalow with a front porch and a yard that needed work, and a kitchen that smelled like old wood and dry paint, and every good thing I had never been allowed to want growing up. I cried when I first walked through it, and Robert, standing in the doorway with his keys in his hand, pretended not to notice. We moved in that November. Robert handled the paperwork. He always handled the paperwork, said it was his way of taking care of people, and by December, Daniel and I were painting the hallway a shade of green we argued about for 2 weeks, and eating breakfast on the porch in our coats because the radiator in the back room hadn't been serviced yet, and somehow that was fine. Everything was fine. Then Robert got sick. Pancreatic cancer. The kind that doesn't give you much time to argue with it. He was diagnosed in January, and by the following October, 13 months after our wedding, he was gone. I will tell you something true about grief, which is that it doesn't belong to just one person, and yet somehow people will fight over it like it does. Margaret lost her husband of 36 years. Daniel lost his father. Audrey, his sister, lost the man who had coached her soccer team and taught her to drive and slow danced with her at her prom because her date had bailed. That loss was real, and I am not asking anyone to diminish it. But grief also does something to people like Margaret. It strips away the effort of pretending. The 4 months after Robert died, she stopped pretending she found me tolerable. The first time she let herself into the house without knocking, I was in the kitchen making lunch. I heard the front door open, and by the time I got to the hallway, she was already standing in the living room with her coat still on, looking around like she was doing an appraisal. "You moved the armchair," she said. "It's our house," I said, gently, because Daniel had asked me to be gentle. She looked at me the way you look at a child who has said something technically accurate but fundamentally impertinent. "Robert chose that armchair," she said, and walked into the kitchen. She came back every week after that, sometimes twice. She had a key. Robert had given it to her years ago, back when the house was a rental and he needed someone local to handle emergencies, and she used it whenever she felt like it. She rearranged things. She left food in the refrigerator that I hadn't bought. She once called the plumber herself for a leaking pipe and gave him instructions that contradicted the ones I'd already given, then told Daniel I had caused confusion. Daniel talked to her. I know he did, because I asked him to, and because he is not a bad man. Just a man who grew up learning that his mother's discomfort was the family's responsibility to manage. The conversations happened. Nothing changed. I am not going to pretend I handled all of this gracefully. There were nights I called my mom and said things I'm not proud of, and nights I said nothing to anyone and just sat on the back porch by myself until I felt calm enough to go back inside. There were fights with Daniel that circled back to the same center of gravity, no matter how we tried to approach them from different angles. You have to say something. I did say something. She doesn't listen. Then make her listen. I can't make my mother do anything, Nora. I know. I know that. But you could try harder. The thing about living inside a slow erosion is that you get used to it. Not in the way that makes it okay, but in the way that makes it daily. You stop noticing the individual moments and start noticing only the weight of the accumulation. Until the dinner. It was the first Sunday in March, 2 years after Robert died. Margaret had started hosting family dinners at our house. Our house. I want to be clear about that, though she had a habit of referring to it as the Whitfield home in a way that made my presence in it feel like a sublease arrangement. Audrey came with her boyfriend, a quiet man named Paul who I liked because he made eye contact when he talked to you. I cooked. I always cooked at these dinners, partly because I'm good at it and partly because, if I didn't, Margaret would, and then it would feel even less like my kitchen. I had just put the roast on the table when Margaret looked around the room with the particular expression she wore when she had decided something and was only now getting around to announcing it. I've been thinking, she said, unfolding her napkin, about the commute. She lived 45 minutes away, in the house she and Robert had shared for 3 decades. I waited. It's getting to be a lot, at my age. She picked up her fork. I've been looking at the spare room, and I think it makes the most sense for me to spend at least a few nights a week here. We have the space. I looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at his plate. This is your home too, Margaret said to him, as if I hadn't spoken. Then she turned to me, and her voice shifted into the register she used when she was being what she considered generous. I know this is an adjustment, Nora, but this house has been in this family for 20 years. It should feel like that. I am telling you this in the order it happened because I want you to understand that I did not plan what came next. I had no plan. I want to be clear about that because what followed looked, from the outside, like something I had been preparing for a long time. I hadn't. I was just a woman who had hit her limit on a Sunday in March, with a roast getting cold on the table. This is my home, I said. Margaret smiled the way adults smile at children who are being endearing. Of course it is, dear. No, I said. I mean it's mine. My name is on the deed. The smile stayed, but her eyes changed. Robert handled the paperwork when he transferred it to Daniel. I'd like to see the deed, I said. I don't know why I said it. I think it was the smile. I think it was the word adjustment. I think it was 3 years of photo frames turned face down, and armchairs moved back without asking, and kitchens that smelled like my home until someone else walked into them. Daniel put his fork down. Nora, I'd just like to see it, I said. Calm. I surprised myself with how calm I was. The deed was in the file cabinet in the home office. In a manila folder Robert had labeled Birchwood in black marker. I had never opened it. I had never needed to. I went and got it while the table sat in silence and the roast steamed quietly into the room. I read it standing in the hallway. Then I read it again. Robert had filed the deed transfer 14 months before he died. He had transferred ownership of 412 Birchwood Lane to one name. Not Daniel Whitfield. Not Daniel and Nora Whitfield. Nora Callahan Whitfield. Solely, entirely. My name, my signature, notarized, filed with the county recorder's office, dated 11 months before his diagnosis and 9 months before ours. I walked back into the dining room. I put the deed on the table. Margaret looked at it, then at me, then at it again. That can't be right, she said. It's filed with the county, I said. You can look it up tonight if you want. Audrey leaned forward and read it. I watched her expression go through 4 different things in about 3 seconds. Paul studied the wood grain on the table. Daniel took the deed from Audrey with both hands. He read it slowly. He has his father's way of reading methodical, line by line, like every word deserves equal consideration. When he looked up, his eyes were not angry. They were something I hadn't seen in a long time. They were sorry. Margaret stood up. This is a mistake, she said. Her voice was still controlled, but the edges of it had changed. Robert would not have done this without telling me. He would not have put a stranger's name. I'm his daughter-in-law, I said. You know what I mean. I did know what she meant. I had known what she meant for 3 years. The deed is what it is, I said. This is my house, Margaret. I'd like you to leave. She left. She didn't say goodbye. The door closed and the room was very quiet, and I sat back down in front of my plate and picked up my fork, because I had cooked that roast for 2.5 hours, and I was going to eat it. Audrey looked at me across the table for a long moment. Then she picked up her fork too. It's good, she said quietly. About the roast. Thank you, I said. Paul nodded. He was a very sensible man. I need to tell you about the part before I found the deed, because I almost didn't go looking. I almost let it go the way I had let everything go for 3 years. Because when you have been told often enough that your discomfort is an overreaction, you start to build a very efficient internal system for talking yourself out of your own instincts. You learn to hesitate before every grievance, to run it through a checklist. Am I being fair? Am I being too sensitive? Is this actually a problem, or am I making it one? I had been running that checklist since the week I moved in, and I was tired of it. I also need to tell you about Robert. 3 weeks before he died, when he was in the hospital and the medication made him drift in and out, and sometimes he didn't know what year it was, he had one clear afternoon. Daniel had stepped out to get coffee. It was just the two of us. And Robert turned his head on the pillow and looked at me with his full face. The way he had looked at me at the wedding reception, not measuring, just present. The house is yours, he said. I took care of it. I thought he was confused. I thought he was thinking of Margaret, or of Daniel, or of some other arrangement I wasn't part of. I held his hand and said, okay, and he nodded like we had agreed on something important. I didn't understand until the deed. I want to tell you about the week after the dinner, because it was harder than the dinner itself. Margaret called Daniel 17 times in 4 days. I know because he told me. And I know because I could hear his side of the conversations from the other room, the low, careful voice he used when he was trying to keep two people from colliding. She didn't call me directly. She called Audrey instead, and Audrey relayed things in the tentative way of someone who had been handed a grenade and wasn't sure if the pin was out. Mom says this can't stand. Mom says Robert must have made a mistake. Mom says she's going to get her own attorney. She did, eventually. A man named Crawford, who came recommended by someone at her church, and who sent a letter to me, not to Daniel, which was something asserting that Robert had signed the deed transfer under conditions of undue influence, and that the transfer should be voided. I called a real estate attorney named Janet Park, whose office was above a dry cleaning shop on Elm Street, and who had a framed print on her wall that said, "Well-behaved women seldom make history," in letters I found both cliched and appropriate. Janet reviewed the deed, the county filing, Robert's mental health records from his physician, and the dates. The transfer was filed 14 months before his diagnosis, Janet said. He was in full health. There is no legal basis for undue influence. She set the file down. She has no case, Nora. She'll try anyway, I said. She might. Janet folded her hands. Let her. I went home and sat in the kitchen and looked at the yard, which still needed work, and the porch where Daniel and I had eaten breakfast in our coats and thought everything was fine, and I let myself feel something I hadn't allowed in a long time, which was the particular quiet of a room that only has one person in it who gets to decide what it is. Margaret did try. She contested the deed through Crawford, who filed a challenge with the county citing lack of capacity and improper process. Janet responded with Robert's medical records, his attorney's correspondence at the time of the filing, and a letter from the notary who had witnessed the signing confirming that Robert had been fully present, had read the document himself, and had signed without hesitation. Crawford asked for a deposition. We gave one. He asked to review Robert's estate documents for evidence of a separate verbal agreement. There was no separate agreement. 3 weeks into the process, Crawford sent a letter to Janet, not to me, not to Margaret, just a quiet letter between attorneys that said, in careful legal language, that his client was reconsidering her position. She dropped the challenge. I found out on a Tuesday afternoon when Janet called me. I was in my car in the parking lot of the grocery store, and I sat there for a while after I hung up, watching a woman load bags into a minivan and a kid on a bike try to bunny hop a curb and miss, and I thought about Robert standing in the doorway of this house with his keys in his hand, not looking away while I cried. I thought about the afternoon in the hospital. The house is yours. I took care of it. He had known who Margaret was. He had known long before I did, the way you know things about the people you love that you spend decades trying to work around. He couldn't change who she was. But he could do one careful, quiet, permanent thing before he left. He did it 11 months before he was diagnosed. Which means he did it not because he was dying, but because he had decided. That matters to me. That matters more than I have words for. There is one more thing I need to tell you, and it is the thing I almost didn't tell anyone. The week before the deed dispute was formally dropped, Daniel came home from work on a Thursday and sat down at the kitchen table, his father's table, the one Robert had brought over from his storage unit the month we moved in, a scarred oak thing with uneven legs that we shimmed with a folded magazine, and he didn't say anything for a while. I made tea. I put a mug in front of him and sat down across from him and waited. He called me, Daniel said, 3 weeks before he died. I was at work and I almost didn't answer, and when I did he said he stopped, picked up the mug with both hands. He said, "I want you to know I'm taking care of Nora. She's the best thing in this family and I need you to make sure she knows that." I didn't say anything. I thought he was confused, Daniel said. I thought he was talking about I don't know what I thought. He looked at me. His eyes were wet. I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to feel like he was singling you out, like there was something to single you out from. But I think he knew. I think he knew exactly what he was doing and exactly why. And I was too much her son to see it. I reached across the table and put my hand on his. We sat there for a while. "You have to stop letting her in," I said. Not angry. Just true. "I know," he said. "I'm going to." He was. It took work. It took the kind of conversations that are too quiet to have once and too important to stop having. It took Daniel calling his mother and telling her plainly that she was not welcome in our home without an invitation, and it took him not walking it back when she cried. It took Audrey, who surprised me, calling me on a Saturday morning and saying, in the same no-frills voice she used for everything, "I think my dad always liked you best. Don't tell Daniel I said that." She laughed. I laughed. It was the first real conversation we had ever had. Margaret did not come around easily. Margaret did not come around at all for a long time. She sent messages through Audrey, through Daniel's cousin, through a mutual friend from their church who probably had no idea she was being used as a diplomatic channel. None of the messages were apologies. They were justifications and reframings and the particular variety of grievance that comes from a person who has never had to reckon with the fact that love can coexist with harm. I am not going to tell you I forgave her. I don't know if I have. Forgiveness is something I am still figuring out how to approach honestly, without performing it because it's what you're supposed to do or withholding it because you're still hurt. I think it's a process with no particular deadline, and I'm giving myself the grace of not rushing it. What I can tell you is what I did with the house. I painted the front porch the color I had wanted since the day we moved in, and Daniel had said was too bold. Terracotta. It looks exactly right. I planted the yard. I took down the 1,987 family portrait from the mantel and put back the wedding photo, mine and Daniel's, both of us squinting into the October sun, and beside it I put a small framed picture of Robert at the reception, laughing at something his brother had said, the way he looked before the illness, when he was just a man at his son's wedding being happy. I kept that image. I kept it the way I keep things that are true and irreplaceable, with both hands, carefully, where I can see it. I still have the deed in the manila folder in the home office. Robert's handwriting on the tab, birchwood in black marker, the same steady capitals he used for everything. I take it out sometimes, not often, and I think about a man who understood exactly what he was doing when he sat down with an attorney and a blank deed transfer, and put one name on the line, not because he didn't trust his son, but because he trusted me. I think about the things that protect us that we don't know about until we need them. The preparations made quietly, by people who loved us without needing to announce it, for situations they hoped would never come and knew might. I think about what it means to take care of someone. I think I'm learning. Before I go, if this story reached you, if you recognized any part of it from your own life, I want you to know something. The things that belong to you belong to you. It doesn't matter how many times someone else calls them theirs, how many times someone rearranges your space or sits at your table like the room was built around them, how many years you spent letting it happen, because the cost of fighting felt higher than the cost of staying quiet. The paperwork still says your name. The key still fits your lock. And somewhere, I believe, there is someone who has already done the quiet work of making sure you have a place to land. If you found this story, hit that like button and subscribe to Quiet Drama Stories. I read every comment. Tell me what you took from this, or tell me your own version of it. The ones that almost didn't get told are the most important ones of all.